Welcome to the end of the stage. Today we have another polarity dialogue, this one titled, What Good is God Talk? As with all polarity dialogues, participants will have an opportunity to speak both for and against an issue before coming together at the end for further dialogical exploration. My dialogue partner for today is Layman Pascal. He will give a brief introduction to get us going. Layman?
In the beginning was the Word God, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word God. Hi, I'm Mutton Chop Jim, and today we're going to talk about language and religion from a vision logic altitude and a slippery sideways attitude. Generally, I think we'll look at how we relate to inherited terminology, and specifically we'll explore the use or non-use of religious wording in developmental discourse in evolutionary communities. Does traditionally metaphysically laden wording open or close futures for us in a post-metaphysical sense? What are the potential theological implications of grammar? What might be the generative linguistic infrastructure of large and small collective renaissances in a manner analogous to the foundation of religions? Obvious stuff like that. So I've prepared a statement denouncing old-fangled traditional terminology, and I prepared another statement denouncing our impulse to use newfangled terminology. And I'm looking forward to exploring different ways of understanding words like religion, God, and faith in a specifically second-tier, meta-level, and integralistic sense. Integralish. Bruce?
Awesome. Thank you, Mutton Chop Jim. I feel like we're news anchors trading off our
Yes.
recorded lines.
And now live to Bruce in the war zone.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with my negative approach first, and then we can just take it from there. I also have a statement, and so I'll give mine, and we can trade back and forth, and then kind of come together in some dialogue after that. So as we approach the topic of religious language and the utility of God talk, we first have to think more generally about the question of terminology, whether when we're interested in articulating a new philosophy or world vision, we should make use of widely known inherited terms or introduce new ones. Naturally, a lot of people criticize the surplus of neologisms in an aspiring philosophy or meta-theory as elitist or pseudo-intellectual or just putting up unnecessary barriers to understanding. But as Brian Swimme reminds us in his discussion of the new story of the universe, any new worldview that can be communicated and understood entirely using inherited concepts and vocabulary hardly merits to be called new. It might be a novel rearranging of the furniture. Maybe we even mount a table on the wall or hang a bed from a ceiling, but it's not a fundamentally new world space. In other words, if we are really concerned about overcoming limitations in past or present paradigms, which have proven to be inadequate or maybe even disastrous for us as a species, then we may be misguided to be too worried about commensurability or so-called learning hurdles between past worldviews and the emerging one. But Brian Swimme doesn't say we need to replace all of our inherited terms, only that any worldview that can be communicated without the introduction of at least some new concepts and terms can't really be called new. So the question then is, what terms do we carry forward and what to discard? And more specifically for our conversation today, what religious terms deserve a continued place at the table of, say, an emerging integral post-metaphysical spirituality? In my opening statement here, I'm going to argue against the utility of carrying forward traditional religious terminology like God, salvation, enlightenment. And that's because a post-metaphysical orientation must take as its base at least a modern or orange world space. A modernist orientation in itself isn't sufficient to our project, but it is an essential starting place. Integral post-metaphysical spirituality aims to be post-postmodern or metamodern, so it will need at least to differentiate itself from past modern or orange universalist synthetic spiritualities, the various forms of religious or meta-religious inclusivism that attempted to enfold other traditions within the general frame of a privileged tradition. Orange universalist or inclusivist projects tended as such to preserve our inherited traditional religious terms, privileging some in order to create a rational universalist master narrative, and then ingeniously fitting or making space for other traditions within the conceptual territory provided by the privileged tradition, or in slightly more mature forms, perennial philosophical framework. The observation I want to make here is that such modernist projects took as their base terms and distinctions and basic metaphysical concepts inherited from pre-modern traditions, primarily red and blue or amber religious paradigms. But why should we take pre-modern metaphysics as the necessary foundation for our worldview, however creatively reconfigured? Why should these worldviews be privileged? Perhaps it is a limited view of religion or spirituality that sees spiritual practice as necessarily tied to and dependent on such old forms. Orange inclusivist approaches took traditional religious terms for granted or as given, even as they attempted to reinterpret them from within a modernist world space. But is an integral post-metaphysical approach compelled to limit itself to or found itself upon pre-modern metaphysics? It seems reasonable, in fact, that a post-metaphysical orientation will start, more likely, with a basic scientific or rational humanist worldview as its foundation. As you discussed in your conversation with Frank Visser recently, we need to be looking for better and better ways to realize a sacred naturalism, to find what is religious in the world as delivered to us in and through our present paradigms, without necessary dependence upon pre-scientific cultures. There's no reason to assume that the way that they carved up the world conceptually is in any way necessary to us now, even if we still want to carry forward their contemplative technologies. If you look at various philosophical analyses of religious language, you find what is an almost embarrassing profusion of theories. There are face value theories, analytic verificationist or logical positivist theories, non-cognitivist theories, use-oriented or performative theories, minimalist theories, and so on. I might get into some of these distinctions and arguments later, but if you survey the field, one impression you're likely to take away is that a great deal of effort is being spent to justify and re-justify and re-re-justify and re-re-re-justify the use of religious language within modern and postmodern contexts. Often it feels in quite revisionist fashion. By that I mean where philosophers argue that whenever religious people use certain types of language, they don't really mean it in the descriptive or referential ways that they appear, and that are almost surely demonstrably wrong within a modern scientific world space, but instead they are speaking only poetically and metaphorically, or to invoke pictures that can impel moral action, or to express prayer or praise without intending to say anything at all about objective reality, and so on. You have the sense of a constant jiggering and rejiggering of an outmoded piece of equipment, an old 8-track player, to keep working. One philosopher, Anthony Flew, uses a phrase that's apt here. God dies a death by 1,000 qualifications. As we keep trying to make the word God serviceable, we end up killing it by endlessly qualifying it. In religious language, should we keep trying to put new wine in old wineskins? From the modernist grounds of post-metaphysics, shouldn't our task be instead to intensify our modern language and disclose its religious potential? But if integral post-metaphysical spirituality is truly post-postmodern, then we should heed also the lessons of post-modernity. And this means, in part, taking seriously the post-colonial critiques of much of our religious thinking and theorizing to date. Despite their appeals to universality, modernist inclusivist projects still tended to be monocultural and colonialist, because even when they attempted to make room for perspectives and concepts from multiple religious traditions. They often did so within a framework which took tradition or culture-specific words such as God or religion, philosophy, salvation to be neutral and pan-cultural. But as Layman Pascal reminds us, God is not a synonym for Brahman. Brahman and God are not possessed of the same qualities or conceived or experienced in exactly the same ways, independent of context or mode of enactment. Similarly, religion and dharma are not synonymous. These terms are better conceived as homeomorphic equivalents. They do not carry the same meaning, but they serve comparable or analogous functions within different cultural world spaces. Quoting Panikar, we can, for example, translate religion by dharma without necessarily translating dharma by religion. Dharma equally means duty, ethics, element, observance, energy, order, virtue, law, justice, and has even been translated by reality. But the word religion can also mean sampradaya, karma, jati, bhakti, marga, puja, daivakarma, nimayaparam, punyashila. Each culture is an entire world. Similarly, we may assume philosophy as a universal interpretive category, but in Sanskrit, we can find at least 33 concepts which serve homeomorphically equivalent functions in Hindu culture and religion without aligning exactly on the level of conceptual meaning. Integral metatheory is, of course, interested in identifying common factors and insights across relative cultural frames and illuminating their entanglement, their commonalities and interrelationships. Identifying homeomorphic equivalencies is one way to do this, which happens to align with the enactive orientation of integral post-metaphysics. But if we follow this logic through, then we can no longer presuppose the adequacy of terms inherited from one particular religious or philosophical tradition. Wilbur, in shorthand, often treats religion as a universal concept, and God, Brahman, Allah, and Sunyata or Dharmakaya as synonyms. But at best, we can speak of homeomorphic equivalencies, and we are pressed to become more properly multilingual and cosmopolitan. Either we learn to speak multiple forms of God talk at once without collapsing them, or we work towards crafting a meta-language better suited to integral post-metaphysical world space. Since I'm arguing here for the inutility of God talk, especially since the homeomorphic equivalents we might want to map still all come from pre-modern world spaces, then I think we are again led to the need to generate new language, new terminology. The search for new language itself can be a form of post-metaphysical or psycho-spiritual practice. Michael Schwartz, in a number of his writings on integral philosophy, speaks of the need to wrestle free from metaphysics as rigorously as possible, however impossible to achieve this may turn out to be. And I think we can say the same with regard to language. In attempting to break with inherited concepts, whether the old God language or classical Western philosophical distinctions, we are immediately confronted with our ontological presuppositions, the givens that shape our world spaces. The refusal to go with what we've inherited forces us to excavate the roots of our meaning making. It can be a powerful practice in itself to find new wineskins for the spirits of our age. So that's my negative or critical volley. There are other reasons to challenge the usefulness of God talk or the wisdom of preserving pre-modern concepts in contemporary spirituality, and I'm sure you're going to get into some of them. To start us off, my basic points are that post-metaphysics, which finds its roots in the scientific revolution and the linguistic turn, one, should no longer consider itself beholden to the language games of pre-modernity, and two, should also wrestle itself free of the naive universalism of modernist inclusivist projects. Both moves suggest the need to come to terms with our past, to put away our embalming tools, and craft new terms for what is emergent and yet to come. And back to you, Mutton Chop Jim.
That's great. I'm trying to overcome my natural tendency to catalog the points that I want to get back to in what you're saying.
Mm.
And just, I really like the care and nuance that I hear and or project into your voice.
Probably largely projection.
Okay, well, I would say that there is far greater richness and potential for ongoing depth in our common inherited language than most people understand. That it's not bound or even primarily rooted in the errors of previous worldviews, because many and perhaps even most of ancient discoveries carry forward. Our ancestors were built like we are, and they were not idiots. Many of them might have been wiser than ourselves, and their collective intelligence in adaptation to real and complex situations has curated a language that we would be foolish to reject or neglect. The habit, in my view, of all the wise ponderers throughout history seems to have been to dig more deeply into the suggestiveness of the words that they have inherited from culture and history and nature. When you take up the ancient symbol and try to extend it and deepen it, that's when you're truly at the leading edge, rather than rupturing your connection into neologism and a kind of linguistic reactionism against who came before you. For example, we inherit a word concept like instantaneous, and then Einstein comes along and tells us mathematically that because there's a maximum velocity at which physical changes proliferate relativistically, no two events can be objectively simultaneous. Do we then get rid of the word instantaneous or simultaneous? No. What we've actually done is clarify it with greater precision. Instantaneous is now something that occurs as fast or faster than the speed at which any measuring process could occur. We've clarified it. We've given it a more precise meaning, and I think that's the balanced, organic, natural, historical, and wise way to go forward with our languaging, rather than neurotically discarding our words with every new real or potential insight. We can upgrade our words with the help of the new insights that we're gathering. And I think today, a lot of people reject this normal responsibility. And as a result, our shared language can be conceived of as withering and fraying. It seems to me as if our corporate culture of perpetual rebranding and sloganeering has disconnected us from the nourishing pathways of natural past languaging and trapped us in a realm of endless marketing and quibbling. Like people who name new cars or rename problematic government agencies, we're always flinching away from the unseemly consonances of words and trying to make new, more abstract, cleaner terminology. We've become cunning and squeamish. But our new terminology is almost always more bloodless, less authentic, and although it is more regulatory and complicated, it is often less organically complex. It combines fewer facets of personal and collective experience that have evolved over time. We lose poetry, vitality, and precision all at once when we start mucking about trying to make decisions about which words can come forward with us on the arc today or not. For example, we often ignore real racism while we're busy trying to keep each other from saying the word nigger. We let insensitive maniacs into the highest corridors of power because people are so desperate for a return to gritty, provocative, and even obscene old-fashioned speech patterns. There are contemporary armies of corrective language control agents who claim that they are progressive agents of sensitivity, rebalance, and reform, but they seem fundamentally not much different than the oppressive, irrational, and dogmatic promulgators of courtly medieval speech. They are obsessed with every new fad about language, about who gets to be called what, and how that relates to social status or public perception, or how we're tactically moving our group project forward. These, to me, are limiting and limited movements that drive energy and attention away from the solution to real human problems, while reinforcing the subhuman delusion that we are computers reprogrammed top down by our linguistic software. I think a lot of people today conspire unconsciously to create an age of perpetual linguistic anxiety in which putatively inadequate or contaminated words must be fought off as if they were the invisible devils who control reality. The word God is an excellent example of what I'm talking about. If we hear that word coming from the mouths of people we don't respect or whose ideas we think are limited, we start thinking it's a misleading, contaminated term that must be replaced, or even that we must take a stand against the conceptual inadequacies of that word. So we let people who we think are fools define our words for us, and then as if we're backed into a corner, we complain about those words and look around for a little vine of new terminology we can climb away on. There's something cowardly about that. We've given up the battlefield before even engaging in the fight for the meaning of the terms. And so we then fail to do what all of our progressive ancestors did. We fail to embrace, feed upon, deepen, and enrich the words that connect us to the world, culture, and ongoing evolutionary history of who we are as embodied beings. Linguistic responsibility and adequate participation in our own culture of language requires that we take on every word we receive as our own and find our best definition of it from our point of view, and then argue for what that ought to mean, rather than flinching away from and giving up ownership of and inventing for ourselves some abstract, bloodless alternative little new toy words that are not much better than political correctness or corporate branding. God is a troubling and misleading word if you don't use it correctly. To use it correctly means to think and feel your own understanding of the highest possibility that can be referenced in language or cognition. It's to connect with everyone, especially your ancestors, who also thought and felt toward the apex possibility of their being. Thought to the limit of thought and felt to the limit of feeling. They oriented themselves, even bodily, toward a coherent excess that spills over from the integration of the faculties of being and allows an overtone, something greater than the sum of the parts to spill back upon you and enliven you. So if you think of God as a word that someone else uses to describe their idea of the highest experience, then you're impious, you're an infidel in religious language. But if you give that word life by allowing it to describe what you feel to be the ultimate condition, then you are pious, aligned with the North Star, helping us collectively to make actual linguistic progress. And this great God or whatever is a point of existential alignment that allows people to interpersonally come together to produce more meaning and more capacity. The reason to use a master signifier is so that you don't have to do all the work yourself in your little mind. It's the master signifier, God, as an invitation to begin coordinating all the different species of knowledge and capacity that exist in a given culture and historical moment, so that we can start building a thriving new cultural field that might actually be up to the challenges we face globally, socially, and personally.
Yeah, thank you. That was really wonderful. Actually, you've convinced me at the outset, and we can just call the conversation off here.
I see I've converted you to the priesthood.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I really appreciate your your invoking the deep time resonance of words and the potential that they can offer if we allow ourselves to be nourished by that without feeling that we have to be tied to that inheritance. That we, that there's a creative carrying forward that doesn't forsake its roots and doesn't sell short our ancestors. I mean, I think that's a really great point, because we're often so ready to do that. So for my positive framing here, I'm going to offer a few complementary views, kind of trading off of some of the things that I've already mentioned, and bringing in what I think would be at least partially orthodox Wilberian perspective. So we'll see. So in considering the usefulness of God talk and religious language in general, we have to look to what it is that we're up to with integral post-metaphysical spirituality. What are we after? What are we trying to realize or enact? One of the strongest, or at least most persistent, criticisms of religious language in the last century came from the logical positivists. A.J. Ayer, for instance, argued that linguistic meaning is either analytic or synthetic. By that, he means that it is essentially a tautology and can be demonstrated to be internally true, or by synthetic, that it is something that can be demonstrated empirically. If a statement is neither tautological or empirically verifiable, then it's meaningless. And religious language, according to Ayers, usually fails to meet either of these criteria. It's full of metaphysical propositions about reality that cannot be empirically demonstrated and so are meaningless and should be discarded. God does not have an empirically demonstrable referent, or so he argued. Is integral post-metaphysical spirituality playing the same game as logical positivism? I don't think so, not fully, but it does respond to its demands for verifiability. In Wilber's framing, one of the main features of integral post-metaphysical thinking is that religious traditions do have means of verifying many of the spiritual phenomena or realities that they invoke. And when they don't, then they are indeed engaged in empty metaphysics. Religious language is salvageable, in other words, if we can show how the realities it invokes can be experientially accessed. If we can demonstrate what practices can lead to their enactment and what levels of development and other factors are necessary to adequately grasp them. So that's one simple answer. After the critiques of modernity and postmodernity, we can resurrect God talk by framing it inactively, which means in integral terms, providing the cosmic addresses and necessary injunctions for these phenomena. Integral theory would actually join the logical positivists in criticizing and dismissing religious language, which deals only in non-demonstrable, naively metaphysical claims. But then it turns around and shows that many of the terms that the positivists took to be empty of content are actually quite meaningful if you have the right injunctions and a community of the adequate to test and confirm your experiences. In the philosophy of religion, many thinkers have responded to the positivist critique by taking another route. Rather than showing that many religious terms are actually verifiable with the right religious or spiritual practices, they argued that religious language is doing something altogether different from empirical science. When people talk about God or use religious language, they're making non-cognitive statements, meaning they aren't necessarily making factual propositions about objective reality, but instead are expressing commitment to a way of life and or using stories that can guide and support certain desired behaviors and moral visions. This is often where appeals to metaphor and mythic language come in. Religious language, properly understood, is poetic and metaphorical. In Michael Dowd's terms, religious language is a kind of night language, a language of dream and vision, and should be distinguished from the day language of empirical science. It's a way of poetically grasping in story form complex concepts, or encoding subjective psychospiritual truths, or inspiring moral action, or higher emotional states. And there's a reductionist way to read some of this. When religious practitioners make appeals to gods or various spiritual powers, entities, or processes, they're referring directly to non-religious phenomena. In other words, these terms actually refer to things that we now understand naturalistically and don't point to anything beyond them, even for the religious practitioners. And I think this relates in a way to what you talk about as colloquialism. So maybe you can touch on that or come back to that later. So in my earlier argument against God talk and the use of religious language, particularly traditional religious language, I mentioned that there was an embarrassing profusion of theories about the truth of religious language, what it is really up to. But that profusion becomes useful if we read it not as an attempt to account for what is actually happening or what religious language has been historically up to all along, but as creative ways for our time that we can justify and continue to deploy that religious language game. We can argue that religious language remains useful and powerful if we can acknowledge its various modes as codifying special states and phenomena that can be accessed through various forms of disciplined spiritual practice, or as non-cognitive use of metaphor and story to communicate psychological truths and processes, or express commitment to a vision, or to teach values and inspire moral behavior, and so on, or even as inactive in itself. For instance, Bruno Latour argues that the religious mode of language is not informative but transformative, A religious statement is true if it transforms the one who receives it and digests it. Similarly, the Anglican Bishop Rowan Williams suggests that religious language is a specialized form of language that puts thought under pressure, that brings thought to silence. Not in all its forms, but in some of its heightened modes, religious language takes the individual to the edge of what is thinkable. Paradoxical language or koans, for instance, can short-circuit habitual modes of thinking and open a clearing where new insight is possible. An integral approach will take most of these claims as true but partial. It may still be valuable to develop new concepts or even a meta-language for our emerging post-metaphysical spirituality. I think it is. But if we take all of these partial truths together, then I think we also have grounds for preserving and continuing to use pre-modern religious language. An integral approach, after all, wants to validate and integrate the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. That could mean only carrying forward some of the pre-modern spiritual technologies and dropping the outmoded metaphysics. But if we're able to frame many pre-modern religious concepts injunctively and to cultivate a cosmopolitan, multi-tradition mythic literacy, and develop greater awareness around the multiple modes as well as the limits of religious language games, then I think God talk remains viable, not only viable, but desirable. We can return to it anatheistically. Ana meaning again or back to. This return to God after the death of God that is happening in contemporary religious studies. It's not simply a re-embrace of pre-modern God concepts. It's a return to the prepositional moment of indecision, in/decision, where we hover in that creative space before we commit to theistic or naturalistic, atheistic paths of meaning. In that space, both theism and atheism are strangers again, and we have the invitation then to host them anew. So that's my positive argument for you.
Okay. Well, now I have to forget about all the things about that I agree with and make my reverse attack. Old tools may be truly profound, but that doesn't make them applicable. I have endless respect for stone axes, but they help me with virtually no tasks in the current universe. And I think it's the same with our traditional word tools. They risk a degenerative return to the most ignorant forms of thinking out of which they emerged and out of which we are collectively struggling to achieve some new sanity, health, and vision. So as much as I appreciate the ancient utility of inherited word tools, they don't empower us in the world in which we actually live. And sensitive people today are constantly confronted by the fact that our inherited and standardized conventional words conceal significant contradictions, deceptions, and multiplicities. The word depression is an excellent non-religious example. Our recent psychiatric ancestors used that word to describe a syndrome associated with a specific set of symptoms, but today's brain scans reveal that some people exhibit those symptoms from lowered brain activity, and some people exhibit those symptoms from excessive brain activity. So if we prescribe the same drug to both groups, we get some radical successes and some radical failures. Our treatment is limited by the categories, words, and implications that we have even recently inherited. Old word tools are in general clumsy and need to be replaced by more refined, multifarious, more precise, and more functional terminology that continues to evolve in tandem with the growth of our knowledge and the depth of our insights. In ourselves, our own new understandings are most likely to emerge very subtly and very fluidly, especially at first, unconfined by the previous structures of our thinking. And those new subtleties need to be reinforced by new words and protected from being swallowed up by the metaphysical assumptions and implied common associations of the old words that we have that are already burdened with implications. We need to create a space to protect emergent insight, and we can't do that with terminology that we ourselves associate with old patterns of insight. So we must have the flexibility to constantly change our terminology and the responsibility to be generators of language rather than passive recipients of history. And we must have the courage to pursue the forefront of our understanding, even or especially where it seems to deviate from the clunky categories of thought that still constrain our solutions by haunting our terminology. And among the worst examples of this inadequate, anachronistic word tool set is the word God. If someone approaches you on the street and asks if you believe in God, you might be able to socially infer what this interaction is going to be about, but rationally speaking, they have not yet even asked you a question. There are a half dozen possible meanings of that word, and some of them are directly contradictory to the other meanings, like whether or not we refer to a specific racial or cosmological giant finite entity or a general invisible infinity. The gap between the finite and the infinite is the largest imaginable gap. And because that exists within the word God, it makes that word into a joke, a word with no real structure. They might as well have asked you if you like people named Doug. You don't have enough information to begin formulating an answer. You might love one Doug and hate another Doug. The signifier doesn't signify. What people bring up when they say God is something that can't be specified, but must be endorsed or not endorsed. And that sabotages language and it sabotages thinking. At that point, you're no better than an ant receiving a pheromonal community message inquiring if you're still absolutely loyal to the hive queen or not. So the sense of an absolute signifier, like the word God, is a demand for the sacrifice of your mind, if not also your life at times. And if God is real, nothing is impermissible. The symbolic overload, presented as the supreme meaningless symbol, is liable to demand anything from you. Save the whales, kill the whales, rescue the princess, rape the princess, kill the king, rape the king. It's very rapacious. And it's an indefinitely flexible sign of sacrificial overload, which inevitably comes at the expense of somebody's well-being and everybody's capacity for making reasonable human progress. And if you don't include the necessities of making rational progress, then you can't transcend that into the trans-rational or the post-rational. You'll always be pre-rational unless you make that effort and that sacrifice. So the word God, for me, even occludes the future of religion and spirituality by inhibiting our access to the truly trans-rational and reducing the most glorious and enriching dimension of human existence into mere language and obedience games. So I'd recommend everyone do what I do. If some terrestrial D-bag asks you about God, tell them you mistrust names. You'd be happy to talk to them about it if only they would describe it rather than naming it. Let the old names die. And if they can explain what they mean without saying the word God, then they might actually be talking about some real particular experience and or power that maybe you have also experienced and therefore should be included within your shared comprehensive real map of reality. That's my let the past die.
That was great again, and you've probably convinced me in the other direction now. So I've got to remove my my saintly garments.
Throw that away.
I piss on you. Interestingly, what you mentioned at the very end there is actually a strategy that some people mentioned for salvaging God language, which is that God is a name, and it's invoking, a reality, but it doesn't describe. It's invoking a presence, but it doesn't describe an object. It's not meant to be taken as a referent to a particular object, but as more of an invocational word.
I try to touch on that in both my positions. I mean, the Lacanians have this concept of the Master Signifier, which I think is explicitly a non-signifying signifier, right? Mm-hmm. So that it plays a role at the center or the apex of any linguistic system. So the question is that any good? Right? Does it provide us with opportunities because it's inherently uncertain? Or is it a scam? Are we being kept in a prison and the door isn't even locked?
Right. Yeah, I think as with our last polarity dialogue, this one is probably going to be unsatisfactory because, we probably really strongly agree with all of the sides that we've just expressed. And, I do. I just want to speak personally, in that I don't use the word God typically in my own thinking, in my own writing. And sometimes for me, there's a little bit of an an edge or a thrill actually of returning to that God language, because for me it has been bracketed off and removed from use, and uh, at least for a period of my life where I moved into a more Buddhist approach towards spirituality and framing of the world. I felt very comfortable being spiritual without any reference to God concept, but there have remained echoes and resonances with my past, my Christian roots, my Christian past. And there is in your earlier talk, that sense of the nourishment and participating in that deep current. There is a kind of a thrill and a joy to be able to kind of return to that and play in that space and to make meaning in that space. And I still feel that pull sometimes. But it does seem, as I think we both outlined in our negative framings, or our negative, offerings here, it really seems in many ways so loose of a concept, so filled with potentially contradictory meanings, that it's often just a minefield to even enter that territory and try to communicate in a meaningful way with other people without establishing a lot of qualifications beforehand, which is what I was referencing in my first talk, that it kind of ends up to be a death by qualifications. It's like, all right, why not just find something that doesn't require all of that? So yeah, I really sit in the middle here, honestly.
Yeah, and the middle is one way to look at it, and maybe a third territory is another way to look at that. Because I think when we look at these two sides, it will be inherently unsatisfying because we're perspectively and emotionally sympathetic to both.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're pretty satisfied with that position.
Mm-hmm.
And that what we might be saying, when we compare it to those two, it's not quite either of them.
Right.
But it may in fact be a thing of its own that doesn't really have to be compared to those two. I grew up without any God talk really in the home, although I was sympathetic to the character of Jesus as an adept.
Mm-hmm.
It was very Eastern and very scientific naturalist in my house, although with magical landscape elements, a shamanic dimension. It took me a long time to grow into this exploration of the traditional theological language. And I think maybe a bit like what you're saying, initially God was a transgressive term for me, like playing with a swear word. But as I got familiar with it and started to get this idea that I expressed earlier, that it's not about salvaging something from the past that might be compromised, where like as if I'm in the perfect position and they made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
It's about my responsibility to keep passing this baton along by giving it the best of my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a switch for me to take it on as a responsibility. And then in the sense of so many meanings, that's where ideally something like integrative thinking comes into play. Because it's not the case that we have to stand before an uncertain signifier and say it could mean anything. It might only mean 9 different things. And it might be that we could make a scale of those things and then isolate an abstract functional component that's common to the whole set and use that abstract component to make a meta definition of what that signifier would mean for us and for any level. Mm-hmm. So that's a challenge. It's a creative challenge going forward. You try to take on a project like integral theism, you have to try to define God in a way that basically accounts for the definitions that word might be given at any developmental level, and in any general cultural context at any level, and then also be able to abstract that out and say that it's a functional part of the meta universe perceived by vision logic. If you can do all of that, then the term's in play again.
Yeah, that's the challenge, I think, is, you know, at what is the strategy for using it, say, in an orange world space? You know, people often will point to other things that serve a God function, a homeomorphic equivalent to God in the orange, you know, or modernist naturalist world space. You know, whether it's, you know, scientific laws that are immutable, or, you know, whether it's money or some other driver of a culture of achievement. But those seem to fall really so far short of the profundity of the use of that term in pre-modern world spaces. There's a disjunction there that's just not satisfying. And so I think that's the unsatisfactory mining of the word God and the relevance of the word God in a naturalistic world space. It's kind of weak metaphorical or analogical alignment with ordinary things such as, you know, like money or something in a culture. It, it weakens it to such an extent that I feel like, you know, there's work that needs to be done just right there at that spot, in preparing a way forward, actually, for thinking about an integral theism. We really first have to get better at even thinking of a naturalist theism, a naturalist use of God.
Yeah, money. I mean, there's this ancient distinction between God and the gods. And you know, I have a critique about the retroactive function of calling what people in the past believed to be gods as gods. I think that's probably a bad translation of what they were going through, because their experience was more colloquial. They might have meant something like powers or principles, because we still do that today. We still talk about money or about arts or about war, in the same sense that we think of the pagans as worshiping gods.
Right.
There's a distinction between those principles, which I think are pretty substantial, right? Some of them are grouped differently than we would group them now, but by and large, they're fairly psychologically and even naturalistically valid if you take what they were talking about as principles of an experiential psychophysical naturalism.
Right.
There's this other term, an overarching term. We refine their concept to produce God in general. There may be homeomorphic equivalents of that, but what do we do with that one? And is it significant? And I think you can find at all the pre-modern or even some of the modern forms a really intense, profound, overwhelming, ultra meaningful symbol. And do we lack something when we lack that ultra meaningful symbol? Do we lack something personally in our inner developmental work? And do we lack a potency that is needed in order to form developmental communities if we lack the use of that signifier?
Right. Yeah, I think that touches on what really feels unsatisfactory about the framing of God within, as it's been typically framed, where we replace it with, you know, homeomorphic equivalents of money or other factors in the society, is that we're actually, in that case, smuggling in the, you know, even earlier polytheistic forms of the gods to serve that function, and bracketing out or not really acknowledging the deeper, more developed concept of God that also we inherit from pre-modern traditions. And so there's an unequal, you know, matching there. We're matching to, you know, mythic forms of the gods when we're talking about the manifestation of you know, godness within modern secular culture. And not adequately finding where God as that really apex signifier plays a meaningful role. And one of the things that, Panikar talks about is we need to, we have a logos for any time period, and we have a mythos. And the logos is kind of like what rationally we grasp onto in order to explain our worldview to ourselves. But the mythos is that which really goes without saying. It's that deep understructure that actually hardly gets articulated. And in that sense, I think there may be a God sense within the modern worldview that remains at the level of mythos, but hasn't entered into the the logos of the time. We haven't
Right.
found a way to properly language it.
That's interesting, my analogy to the pagan to Christian conversion.
Yes.
I think there's, from the integral point of view, in terms of the logic of a subject developing into its next subject by objectifying itself, and not just itself, its world, its multi-quadrant self. There's something about making clear to yourself the logical infrastructure of your experience of reality, which allows that reality to become something you contemplate and grow beyond, if we're using that Keegan logic, right? And so it's not just I'm in the upper left and I'm observing my own arising thoughts and emotions and beliefs, and then I'll transcend those into a bigger me by looking at that as content. There's also the apparent reality in which myself and everyone else is engaged. And that's orchestrated by a fundamental logic of meanings, which may be fundamentally dependent upon this apex or central signifier, which always has to remain somewhat ambiguous. And if I don't get a good mapping, if I don't make explicit to myself the infrastructure at the level of language and grammar of what I'm living, then I won't really fully be able to go to that next level. And that would be true at every level. So if you have a God, which is to say an ultra meaningful signifier at the center of your language web, and you don't really assimilate that, it might act as a brake on your expansionary development.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I really feel like that there's something like that happening, and that there's a failure to adequately identify it or make it into object. I think in speaking about the pagan to Christian conversion, yeah, it's a movement that even happens within paganism. I'm thinking about, like, within Hinduism, the proliferation of all the gods, but there's also Narayan, and Narayan really is a way of speaking about Godhead, Godhead of all the gods, and so you find that similar movement towards some concept that leads you to the edge of thinking, right? That leads you to confront your own contingency and possibly open a kind of, existential and spiritual clearing internally. Raimon Panikar talks about 9 ways not to talk about God, and yeah, maybe if people are listening to this, they could go reference that and what he goes through. But one of the things that he talks about, if I'm recalling correctly, is that to adequately speak God, it's a discourse that's sui generis. It's a unique kind of discourse. You can't actually do God talk in the same casual way that you refer to, to tables or to presidents or monarchs or anything like that. That it's a different kind of language. It's a different kind of engaging and thinking that actually takes you to your edges. And for him, even to approach adequate God talk requires achieving an interior silence, basically requires the ability, maybe referring back to what your Keegan reference, where it requires construct awareness, right? So I think in part by the silence, what he's talking about achieving silence is actually achieving a, you know, a causal clearing in your awareness in which the arising of language forms, you know, becomes in some sense, you know, transparent. Um, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think, yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about the, you know, this task I mentioned of going through the levels and making sense of God at each of the levels. And maybe if you want to say what God is at a meta level, you have to sort of align what God means at all the first tier levels.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a snag point, right? Something like that works pretty well right up to maybe monernism, and then gets really tricky at postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
I think we miss a lot of the valid forms of it at modernism because we've engaged this discourse about science versus religion.
Mm-hmm.
And we often forget that a lot of the original scientists were very profound religious characters, right?
Yeah.
That we have deism, we have the Masons, we have the Illuminati, there was an enormous orange religion going on that now is probably still present, but diffuse and tarnished to some
Mm-hmm.
degree. And I think it's limiting at Orange to think of this talk as merely metaphorical and poetic, although
Mm-hmm.
that's useful. It's
Yeah.
very useful to do that, and it keeps it in play. But it has a tendency to say, well, that's your, say, upper left. That's your personal poetic take on things.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just that, because there is a logical infrastructure to all the quadrants, insofar as all the quadrants can be cognized and named.
Mm-hmm.
So the apex signifier is tetra. It's intraquadral. It's got to be the peak of a pyramid with a square base. They come
Yeah.
together there because there's a language of recognition. There's a set of symbolic signifiers. There's a code necessary to process all the quadrants. And that code requires convergence in an endlessly incomplete signifier that describes their collective total resonance.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's not merely a personal, metaphorical, psychological dimension. It's something necessary to every level. And I think that idea of convergence is one of the fundamental integral points to bring into the whole analysis,
Mm-hmm.
because the lack of that notion of convergence sabotages the postmodern as well, because the postmodern set of insights, like I was saying about Lacan's Master Signifier, that's really good. You know, structuralism and post-structuralism and the notion of the spider at the center of the web, right? What does the big other rest upon? Terrific. But if that's imagined in a neutral universe that merely conditions social language games, then it's not truly understood, because that level, that pluralistic postmodern level of processing, it has all these other dimensions as well. It has wonder, it has its own poetry, it has its own peak experiences, and all those things have to fold into that. So if you understand the Master Signifier as a language game or a political tool, great, but partial. You have to also understand it as the epicenter of transcendent galactic or intergalactic scientific wonder, as the epiphanies of intercontextuality. And then I think if you do that, if you bring convergence in at each of the levels, then you can align them pretty well, and you can abstract out from that a concept of God that could be applicable in an inter-stage, inter-quadrant manner. But I'd make a further distinction there, because I think there's two things you could abstract out of that. And like you were saying, you don't use God a lot in your spiritual self-talk, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
The way you frame it. I actually do use it quite a bit. And when I do, I'm aware that I'm specifying something as opposed to something else.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's two ways in vision logic space to validate the concept God and its homeomorphic equivalence. One is to say, we accept first, second, and third person lenses on reality. We accept them all as valid. They don't get in each other's way. They're complementary. That's great. And therefore, there is a total process, however I can understand that, omnipresence, emptiness, fullness, reality itself. And I can engage that in the second person.
Mm-hmm.
That's valid. Okay, that's great. But when I think God, that's not what I think. That's not what I feel. Right? It's not the I, thou of isomorphic equivalence of all things. It's specific. It's God as a teleological entity, as a law, as the will of God, as a requirement, as a specificity, right? And so what I see is like I'm looking down the barrel of that convergent apex.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at the center of the mandala. I'm looking at, the Aztec Mayan calendar,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's got the faces coming in right at the center.
Yeah.
That's who I see, right? And he's not everywhere in the calendar. He's right there. It's the white light that Dante's angels are spiraling into. Has a nexus quality to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that nexus is present wherever a holon docks into the next holon. It does it at that emergence point.
Mm-hmm.
And that emergent point could be anywhere, but it isn't equally everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That it has a polarization to it. And that polarization gives it a quality and a desirability and a moral demand upon us to participate in that in the degree to which we feel that and see that.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And I'm thinking about your past, conversation with Frank Visser and your attempts. I'd like to see it happen if he's really open to that. Maybe he won't be, but to see, where he sits spiritually. And I'm just thinking about, what you've described here. And I think the point about looking at religion primarily in metaphorical or, analogical terms, it's valid. It's good up to a point, but yeah, it's inadequate, and it doesn't get to that deeper role of that convergent apex intuition that we have. I think one place that we can look maybe in postmodern thought for that, I think Derrida was feeling his way towards that, partly in his invocation of Cora, of that pregnant gap right at the center of things, but also in the invocation of the messianic, that which is calling from above, and that does serve as a point of historical and personal convergence and also reckoning. So yeah, I think work needs to be done in that area. Really, I think to give language to that site of convergence as a power, that can be psychoactively operative in us, to find ways to language that in modern and postmodern world spaces in order to deal with what Wilbur calls the orange ceiling. Because otherwise, I think we keep coming up to this issue of, if we have second tier thinkers or integral thinkers who are daring to transgressively, reenact the God language, we're going to continually have this battle of folks at orange and green, seeing that actually as regressive, as a return to pre-modern forms that are definitely outmoded, scientifically unnecessary. You don't need to invoke God to describe the process of evolution and everything that that Frank talked about. So until we really zero in and focus on how we can achieve this, in a compelling way, to achieve God talk adequately and with with sufficient, with depth, that honors the integrity of modernist and postmodern thought, and the potential depth that maybe is not actually yet surfaced,
Yeah.
or 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 yet mined. These things may be too new for us to really do that, if you know what I'm saying. So
Yeah, and we can't really know where it's going, but I am very sympathetic to certain kinds of past phrasing. That
mhm,
this convergent point in the mandala that I was talking about, that's what I think of when I think of the connective points in Indra's net, say,
mhm,
or many of the ancient visual images,
mhm,
whether it's, those drawings that were done for Dante's God, or whether it's any of those fantastic Hindu images,
mhm,
right? When they show you the cosmos, or even when they show you the regular yantras and mandalas,
mhm,
there's what's at that center, what
mhm,
organizes that space for us and reflects back to us our sense that all of that has a complementary coherence.
mhm,
And that complementary coherence, it's too big, it doesn't fit in just us, it doesn't fit in any of the parts. It
mhm.
has a concentrated gestalt that we either align ourselves toward or reject.
Right.
But like you were saying about the critique, that's really useful because if you go forward as a trans-rational community, you're going to run into two kinds of problems. One is people who uh, have an emotional or social rejection of any of this kind of languaging,
Mhm,
but the other is people who are a little too careless in borrowing ancient languaging and in asserting the connections that they've made in their own moments of profound insight.
mhm.
And so people who are very grounded in orange and green scientific and social critiques, or who are just temperamentally leaning in that direction, we need them there to rub up against
Mhm.
our tendency to go in the other direction. Those forces need to constrain each other to maintain our balance in an ongoing fashion.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a way to see. This is the way Panikar would frame it too. That atheism is a development in theism. Right.
Yeah,
It's a moment of purification. It's a moment of really clarification, and it's a moment of challenging, inadequate ways of thinking. you know, and so I think it's essential, and we have to honor that. And so I think that's one of um, the sticking points right now, I think, for the appreciations, of any possibility of, uh, you know, uh, that word I mentioned in my talk of anatheism, right? Um, it's an embrace of theism and atheism, but it's neither, right? It's a return to a different kind of position. It actually is a movement that's gone through the death of God and honors the death of God. It sees the value in that death, right? As an important step. Um, so whatever is forward, whatever is, moves our next step in the integral
mhm,
space, it has to fully absorb the lessons of atheism, right? Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
The
yeah.
yeah,
So it's there is a return to that language that I think I heard what you were saying, is that there is possibly in maybe Wilber's writings, or occasionally, or just in the integral community, maybe a too easy, too casual, too facile use of old religious terms, as if they're just obvious and they just are carried forward in an obvious way into this world space, that kind of bypasses all of the work and the refinement of thinking that goes on in the modern and postmodern world spaces, as if whatever they did didn't really matter, didn't really count. And so it's not the case. Maybe I think there is a case that we can make, that I think we've both tried to make, that we can still use these words in a way that's in alignment with that, but maybe we aren't doing that with enough care, right?
Everybody will be called upon to continually do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't happen in a moment. It's an ongoing part of your practice to try to balance those things out. You're not going to be perfect at it,
Right?
You're not going to be completely in command of all scientific logic and data so that you can counterbalance your naive mysticism to just get to true mysticism.
Right.
It's capacity. It's like doing planking or something, like, or you're doing a yogic move. At first you can do a minute, maybe in a few years you can do 5 minutes of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we shouldn't be upset if somebody can only produce a certain amount of atheistic or rational or postmodern critique against their mystical tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
Right? These things all have to be in play, and as people go forward, they're going to hopefully develop more strength and more ability to balance that out.
Right.
Yeah. Even when a person goes off on a single direction, they may be going down a tunnel that has something valuable for the rest of us. So we have to be cautious, even though in general our mood should be to help them not go down one pathway to an extreme.
Right.
Even if that's just because that means it's going to be very difficult for anyone else in the community to process any of their insights.
Mm-hmm.
And community is it's an interesting part of this. You mentioned that quote about religious talk is true not in a factual sense, but because it transforms you.
Mm-hmm.
And from my definition of religion, I would say, yeah, like anything that transforms you as opposed to informing you is religious talk in
Mm-hmm.
that sense. Because
Right.
there really isn't one set of terms that's religious. We look back on a certain set of terms, but only, I think, because those terms were produced by a certain procedure relative to the language those people had.
Right.
We can keep that procedure going. So there's a transformative function of experience that I think gets to a place that could just as well be called religion, but doesn't have to be. We use a trans-religious terminology, whatever you said, and theism.
Mm-hmm.
No God is a perfectly valid name of God as far as I'm concerned. In the 10,000 names of God, well, no God created the universe, and no God tells us what to do. Well, great. I'll call him no God then. But that's the freedom to make use of and to cultivate and encourage individual transformations and collective coordination seems to me to have an important role in community formation, especially if we want those communities to be robust and not merely a collection of people exchanging their philosophical opinions with each other. Right? To have an effect in the world, integrative level communities need to have the vigor of real communities, and they may need to do those things that help real communities come into being, to organize, to be coherent, to be strong, to be passionate. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about the concept of the sacred, the concept of a call, of an external demand, because post-metaphysically, we want to be cautious about that, right? We want to say that it might not be a good idea to say there is a space outside of the space in which there is an entity other than the entities who sent us a call.
Right.
That's a very dangerous step. On the other hand, there are many spaces, there are many entities, and there definitely is a call. So how central is the call, the sacred call, to the formation of community strength, and therefore to the formation of viable integral communities?
I feel that it's important, and one way I approach it in my own thinking is through, Sloterdijk's notion of you know, that internal vertical tension that all beings feel. That you could frame it negatively, that is this all, or you know that it can't only be this, right? You know, to see ourselves and to see to recognize that more is possible, right? And that uh, I think we're kind of circling around a topic that we've talked about elsewhere, and we don't really have to go over it again. But the notion, particularly as you express it, of religiosity or spirituality as a generation of a sacred excess, through the convergence of multiple factors and their integration. And I think a holonically minded integral culture is going to be cautious about assholons, right? About the idea that there is one single apex point, one single master holon, right? And so there's a kind of uh, a pancentrism that kind of emerged that I've talked about in some of my own writings on prepositional theology and co-presence, where every single site is that site of the centering and the of everything else, right? That and that our work, at the work of any individual, the work of any holon towards integrating the fullness of its relations, is where that generation of excess happens. And it's that sense that there is greater depth of relation and integration possible, greater depth of meaning, that I think serves as that call, that messianic call, which can function at the individual level in terms of personal practice, but also in terms of achieving new forms of community.
Yeah, I think there's a danger in thinking about the communities that move us forward individually and can address our collective challenges, of thinking about all of that in a way that's ephemeral,
Mm-hmm.
too abstract. Like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we've got a solution. Hey, we've got a scheme for new living. And very often those things don't replicate the conditions under which actual communities historically emerged.
Mm-hmm.
And my impression is that emergence requires a shared spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, people won't feel they have the energy and confidence to access higher personal and shared capacities.
Mm-hmm.
And that spirit is in many ways dependent upon, like we've often talked, the integration of different genres or disciplines of living.
Mm-hmm.
Many things from many different dimensions have to be brought together, held together, mutated together to
Mm-hmm.
create a style that serves the people and reflects back to them something numinous that they think of as a special spirit that they share.
Right.
And I think that's the engine. If the engine isn't on, that community's not going to do very much,
Right.
especially on the world historical stage, which is the stage at which we could address, say, planetary level meta crises.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important. Now, in that process, historically, it seems like people in different areas of the world produced over time an awareness of an infrastructure that allows that merging to occur. And that infrastructure is broadly theological,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say it's philosophical plus it has an excessive meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the status of that infrastructure is uncertain, I think, right? Did it emerge or was it always there?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something fundamentally uncertain about patterning in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are all complex patterns always existing in digital pattern space and we just tap them? Or are they produced over time out of rock and meat space?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. One way of looking at it is you have to presuppose the existence of logical patterns in order for even perception to occur.
Mm-hmm.
For there to be any world at all that's conceivable, you have to presuppose some logical substructure.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the epicenter of that logical substructure, right? What guarantees consistency and coherence to however extravagant or minimal a set of logical substructures you think you need as the involutionary presuppositions? What's at the center of that?
Mm-hmm.
Why are the logical presuppositions logical?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's become something like Chris Langan calls it logical theology. I think it's roughly what Descartes was talking about, right? Well, I remember being in university and thinking, what an idiot Descartes was. I can doubt my existence and the existence of God, no problem, right? But then you look back, you think, what a moron I was. You know, like, it's like, when I'm 21, I guess I'm smarter than Descartes. Right? It's pretty easy to be flippant about the past.
Yeah.
But when I really got into Descartes, I thought, yeah, he's saying that the fact that anything makes sense means there's something in sense making that we have to be able to count on.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be able to count upon it completely, or
Mm-hmm.
there's no sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the God of the causal logical infrastructure of being.
Mm-hmm.
Now it seems risky to say it was always there and it came down into our forms.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems equally risky to say it was never there and we just built it up in a completely open space.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can't even, how building up and how the open space could be without something that makes sense already, I don't know.
Right. Right.
So I'm 50-50 on whether the God structure was always already there or not.
You know, Descartes, he went and thanked the Black Madonna for giving him his vision after he, right?
Yeah, I remember that really changed my opinion of him, actually, because I'd read that he had a dream in which an angel told him that reason and mathematics would conquer the world. And I'm like, an angel told you? Okay, this is more complicated than I thought.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that, you know, and I think bringing that kind of stuff forward, you know, it's not to, you know, well, I'm not going to even say that. I think bringing that kind of stuff forward into our story, you know, will enrich, not detract from. You know, I think those are like hidden away, like embarrassing little corners, you know, in the modern narrative. And you know, you could rationalize it away and say, oh well, he was still embedded in a mythic culture, and so naturally interpreted that way. But yeah, you know, sure, you can go that route, and you know, I think there's another way to just like bring all of that forward in a way that that's exciting, you know, that reveals the complexity there, that we don't have to just, the fact that happened for him, we don't have to automatically treat it as a regressive holdover in him. Yeah. Right? How can we interpret it? And I don't want to open up another long line of inquiry around that. I think we're at a good time here. We've been almost an hour and a half, and as friend David Long had demonstrated to us and told us, be careful about how long you go. So anyway, yeah, I really enjoyed this talk and exploration with you, and I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, but I'm thinking, you know, I'd like to definitely invite anyone who's watching this to you know, weigh in with where you sit with all of this, and have we been yeah, I can imagine already that you know, for some, we've maybe ventured even a little bit too far into entertaining theistic possibilities. But to me, it's a rich territory, and as I said, I think there's a lot more to be done, even at bringing out the fullness of you know, a religious sensibility at orange and green, in the sense that we're talking about often, which is, you know, that that deep mining and integration that can happen within a space that generates insight, that experience of an insight into that excess. Yeah. Anyway, that won't keep circling around that.
Yeah, I love this conversation. Intellectually, it excites me, but also every time this ultimate virtual center of the mandala great hole on signifier is mentioned, something happens to me.
Mm.
And I feel like it's something good. It's
Mm.
like being polarized to a magnet, whether or not the magnet's there or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel it's productive, right? There's a big part of me that relates very strongly to historical characters who devoted themselves to God, if what I'm experiencing is what they meant by God.
Right, right.
And that kind of framing where you say, listen, what we mean by God could be called God or not, right? Just like what we call religion doesn't need to be called religion. It could be called something else.
Mm-hmm.
Might just as well be called social coherence or renaissances or whatever it is. But I think there's a way to validate things, and that validation requires us to use a frame that says it's not precisely what you think of this thing as meaning. You could mean the opposite because we're describing a more complex structure.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you want to invent new terminology for that, or maybe you want to invent a new meaning within the existing terminology. Those are both really viable options for language in general and for religious language particularly, as long as we have that frame and that sense that we actually can think about and take that risk and maybe get somewhere.
Yeah, I really resonate with that, and I'm being halfway facetious and joking by wearing this garb, even though I am really an ordained minister now.
I heard you did a wedding.
Yeah, I did that wedding. But there's part of me that always has sought that man of God life, not in really the traditional sense ever, but as a life organized around a particular mode of intensity, and a particular willingness to push towards both the limits of what is thinkable, and towards the possibilities of greater self-harmonization and coherence, and and coherence with the world, with others. That life, that process, a life organized around that process is still compelling to me, even if we strip away all the traditional religious language, as I argued in the first part. That I'm totally fine with that. We can do that, or I think we've made good cases why this language is still really rich and resonant, and actually has that transformative potential, engaged with care.
I agree.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks a lot. Yeah, great to talk to you today.